of our fellow Americans in the importance of some traditional values that had been our sources of strength and unity, faith in God, fidelity to families, to spouses, to children, fidelity to our country, patriotism, loyalty to our communities, had very significantly eroded over the past decade and a half before. And so I thought to myself, well, what are we going to do to try to rebuild fidelity among our people to these principles? And it occurred to me that there's a day for this and a week for that and a month for the other thing. Why not have a month devoted to restoring fidelity, fidelity to God, fidelity to our spouses and our families, fidelity to our country and to our communities? So I put out the call on my social media accounts, and sure enough, a number of people got in touch and said, yes, we need to do this. Let's do it. And so what emerged is a grassroots movement. There's no leadership, there's no budget, there's no administration, there's no staff. It's a ground up movement to restore fidelity to its proper place in American society. And let me tell you why I think that's very important. Our nation does not have its foundations or its strength in a shared ethnic background or a shared racial heritage or a shared cultural background or even in a shared tradition of religious faith. We come from many different ethnicities and races, we Americans. We come from many different traditions of faith: Protestant, Catholic, Christian, Jewish, Eastern Orthodox, Latter-day Saints, Muslim, Buddhist, Hindu. We come from very different cultural histories. So what binds us together as a people? Where do we go, especially when times get tough, for unity and strength? Well, of course, there is our great Constitution, our founding principles, those of the Declaration of Independence, those in the Constitution. But beyond that, Americans have always found their strength and unity, their bonds, in a shared commitment to God from our different traditions of faith, in a shared belief in the importance of fidelity to the family, because the family is the fundamental unit of society. And of course, in patriotism, in loyalty to our country, in gratitude to our country and to our communities that do so much for us. So it's important that we be contributing members of those communities and of this nation, and not just think of ourselves as takers. So that's how Fidelity Month got launched, and that's what Fidelity Month is. And this webinar, launching Fidelity Month for 2026, is going to focus on one of those principles. We'll talk about the others along the way, but that one is the principle of the importance of fidelity to our country. This is the 250th anniversary year. Just a month from today, we'll celebrate the 250th anniversary to the day of the founding of the United States of America, the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, with its great principle that all men are created equal, that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, and among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So we've gathered together a wonderful panel, truly an all-star panel, to discuss fidelity to country in light of the principles and the values of the Declaration of Independence. Let me now briefly introduce our very, very distinguished guests. Dr. Ben Carson is the founder and chairman of the American Cornerstone Institute. As I'm sure you all know, he most recently served as the Secretary of the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the 17th person to hold that office. For nearly 30 years, he served as Director of Pediatric Neurosurgery at the Johns Hopkins University Children's Center. Dr. Carson is well known as one of the most eminent medical people, one of the most eminent surgeons in the whole history of our nation. His gifts, especially in child surgery and pediatric surgery, are truly legendary. And he assumed that position at Johns Hopkins when he was just 33 years old, making him the youngest director of a division in the history of Johns Hopkins University's hospital. He's received dozens of honors, richly deserved awards, including, of course, the highest of all for our country, the Presidential Medal of Freedom. Erica Bakioki is a legal scholar who works at the intersection of constitutional law, political theory, women's history, and Catholic social teaching. She's a professor of the practice at the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University, one of our nation's leading civics centers, part of the new civics movement, making such a profound difference in civic education at the university level all over the country. There, she directs the Mercy Otis Warren Initiative for Women in Civic Life and Thought and serves as founding editor of its journal, Fairer Disputations. She's also a fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center and a senior fellow at the Abigail Adams Institute in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And Devorah Goldman. Devorah is a fellow of the Ethics and Public Policy Center. She works there in the program on bioethics, technology, and human flourishing. Her work focuses primarily on medical policy, culture, and public bioethics. She's the director and editorial mentor of the Krauthammer Fellowship at the Tikva Fund, named for my great beloved dear friend, who was also a colleague of Dr. Carson's and my own on the President's Council on Bioethics during the Bush administration, Charles Krauthammer. DeVore is also chief contributor to Etzem, a column on bioethics, medical policy, religion, and culture, published by Mosaic Magazine, that leading journal of Jewish thought, Mosaic Magazine. Her writings have appeared in National Affairs, The Weekly Standard, The New Atlantis, Bloomberg, The Washington Times, and other outlets. Welcome to all of our distinguished panelists and guests today. Ben, my dear, dear old friend, may I begin with you? I'd love to hear your reflections on the meaning of that document, now about to turn 250 years old, in some ways by American standards, an ancient document. What does that document mean for us today?
Well, Robbie, I want to thank you for reviving the topic of fidelity. It seems like we've kind of strayed away from it, and it's such an important part of the establishment of our country. When you stop and think about it, what other country do you know of whose founding document acknowledges our Creator as the entity that gives us our rights? And when you talk about fidelity, when I look through the Bible, one of the things that God hates the most is lying. Why does he hate lying so much? Because it inherently destroys fidelity. One of the most devastating things that can happen in human relationships are infidelity and marriage. Very difficult to repair. So this is a topic that, we've allowed to just grow under the brush and not really think about our obligations to fidelity and to each other. And when you think about the United States of America, it was fidelity to our values that made the difference. There are hundreds of countries, but how many countries are there that rose in obscurity from a bunch of ragtag militiamen to, in record time, becoming the pinnacle of the world? And some people say, it's just a coincidence. It's not a coincidence. It's because of the values that we had. It was because of the relationship that we had with our Creator. It's because of the relationship that we had with God. And you mentioned all the different religions, but one thing they all have in common is a sense of fidelity to God and to various forms of a God as they understand them. But it gives us a moral basis. And that's what's so important. When Alexis de Tocqueville came to America and studied all the various entities that made us great, because the Europeans couldn't quite understand how a nation barely 50 years old was competing with them and everything. But, in his look at democracy in America, the 2-volume set, at the end, he said, America is great because America is good. And if America ever ceases to be good, she will cease to be great. And fidelity is what allows us to pursue that path of goodness.
Yeah, man, that's so powerful. The references to God in the Declaration, to the Creator who endows us with our fundamental rights, creates us all equal. Sometimes people think that's just decorative language, but it's really substantive, isn't it? Because The proposition being put on the table in that great second sentence of the Declaration is that our most fundamental rights, and of course the obligations that are the other side of the coin when it comes to rights, our fundamental rights and obligations do not come from the state. They don't come from the king, they don't come from the president, they don't come from the Congress, they come from the parliament. They come from no merely human power. They come from the hand of God himself. And the upshot of that, it seems to me, is that since the government didn't give them to you, the government cannot legitimately take them away or violate them. And so the next sentence of the Declaration talks about why we have government at all. And of course, the most fundamental purpose of government, as the Declaration says, is to protect those rights which the government did not confer, but which it's the government's obligation to, in the language of the Declaration, secure. To secure these rights, governments were instituted among men.
Hmm.
Erica, can we move over to you? What are your thoughts on the contemporary meaning of the Declaration?
Yes, thank you for having me. It's wonderful to be with you all and really reflect on this wonderful document at this time in our nation's history. I have been thinking and writing, doing a lot of research in the last, long time, maybe 20 years, but especially the last 5 to 10 years, really with regard to rights theory, just how we think about rights in our country. And I think, and really in the West, and I think there's a place where, Dr. Carson spoke about the loss of the meaning of fidelity, especially in something like marriage, which of course we'll hopefully talk more about, and how that undergirds so much, the family undergirds so much of, um, what we all do together in terms of our obligations to one another. But I think in some ways, this passage sometimes, where we are endowed, we sort of skip over the part about God, but this idea of inalienable rights, and among them are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. That sometimes the idea of rights is given a very different meaning than the one that the founding generation had, and that is sort of rights for autonomy, rights to kind of do what I will instead of what I ought. And I think it's helpful to kind of fill in the missing piece that was assumed by the founding generation, even someone like Jefferson, who of course was the author, but not the only author, on the committee with
Mhm.
others of this document, to kind of fill in the piece that was missing, that they all assumed. But now, because we have this text, and sometimes we don't have the long history and the assumptions they had, that it's helpful to fill in, like, what's the gap that might be helpful to understand how they understood these rights. Because certainly, as you say, Robbie, they're given to us by our Creator. But there's something about the nature of rights that has to do a lot with the kind of nature that God made us to be. So we are a particular kind of being, we human beings. And this is something the founders knew very well, not only from their Christian faith, but also from their reading of great texts of the West. Of course, John Locke, who was influential with the Declaration, especially, but even more so, people like Cicero and Montesquieu and Blackstone. And these are texts that we tend not to read anymore. So we've lost some of the content that fills out these words. And so the missing step seems to be, like, when these men were writing about being endowed with rights by our Creator to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, they had an understanding of the kind of human beings we are, that what is it that gives way to happiness? Like, what is the pursuit that we need liberty for? Because liberty, of course, is not an end point in this view, but it's a means, just like, our very life is a means to do certain things. um, and so it's always for carrying out our obligations, for becoming virtuous human beings who can be happy. And this whole understanding was basic to the founding generation. I mean, reading, if you can't get much into Cicero without understanding how much rights and duties are always knit together, never separate, never
Mhm.
separate. And so I think a really great line for this, though he comes far after the founding, is John Henry Newman's statement that, with regard to our Creator, our religious liberties, that we have rights because we have duties, right? We have rights of conscience because we have duties, because we owe something to God. Therefore, we have rights to fulfill our obligation in piety and justice to God. And so that goes for our other rights and duties too. And the last thing I'll say, because of course I can't go too far into this conversation without saying that the women I study in the mid 19th century and even before that, the early women's advocates, of course, drew upon these very same principles when they articulated their claims for women's rights that they are always articulating. And I can, map out for you many, many, many quotations and primary sources to show how they were always understanding their rights as as correlated with their duties, that they thought that they needed rights in the industrial age and the new political economy, with the move away from an agrarian household, and because they had duties to God, to their family, to their husbands, and otherwise, and that's why they wanted to enunciate these rights, and they even used, at Seneca Falls, the very first local convention, they used some of the language of the Declaration to do so. But I think because we can sometimes read Jefferson's words wrongly, we sometimes can also read those words wrongly, and we sort of see, we kind of impute to them some vision that we have today, that rights theory has today, that is all about autonomy and all about really something closer to license, which is exactly what the founding generation disputed, exactly what those early women's rights advocates were not interested in, kind of affording permission for. It was very much to carry out their duties to others.
Those are such important points, Erica. Um, just before he died, just a few months before he died, Jefferson responded to a question that had been put to him by Henry Lee. Lee had asked President Jefferson, now of course in retirement, um, where did you get those wonderful new ideas for the Declaration of Independence? And Jefferson responded, the very elderly Jefferson, just a few months away from his death on July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day of the Declaration of Independence, on the same day that his friend, then enemy, then friend, John Adams died. Jefferson responded, and this was no false modesty, he responded by saying, there were no new ideas. I was simply, he said in his letter to Henry Lee, I was simply giving voice to what he called the harmonizing sentiments of the American people as they have been shaped by the common sense of our people, as reflected in the what he called the elementary books of political right. And then he gave a non-exhaustive list of four authors, four examples. He said, as in Aristotle, Cicero, Locke, and Sidney. Now, people are surprised when they hear about this because so many people have come to think of the Declaration as purely an Enlightenment document, purely the influence of Locke. But it's not just Locke. Locke's important, as you say, Erica. It's also Sidney, a very different kind of Enlightenment figure, but very different kind of view. And not just Enlightenment figures, but Aristotle, and as you reported several times in your comment, Cicero as well. He's really drawing on the best of what has come before. Of course, is a non-exhaustive list. He could have added the Bible. It certainly was shaped by Rome and Athens as to get us to Philadelphia, but also Jerusalem, and especially, of course, the teachings of Genesis 1 that the human being is made in the image and likeness of God and is therefore a bearer of inherent dignity. There's where you get the idea that all men are created equal. Not an idea, by the way, you get from Aristotle or Cicero, or from any of the great Greek or Roman thinkers, as admirable as they really are. They didn't get to that idea of inherent and equal dignity. You get that from Jerusalem. You get that from Genesis 1, that the human being is fashioned in the very image and likeness of God. Devora, over to you. How about the Declaration of Independence and its contemporary meaning as you see it?
Hi, thank you so much. It's a challenge to follow all of you, but I'm delighted to be here. And I found it interesting as an intellectual project just to consider the idea of thinking about the Declaration of Independence through the concept of fidelity, since fidelity emphasizes, of course, loyalty and giving of oneself. And the Declaration of Independence, at least the title suggests that and the content too, of course, suggests an absolving of allegiance and a breaking away
Mm.
from what you felt you previously owed. But I think that it's worthwhile looking at the tone in which the document is written. And as Dr. Carson noted, there is this thread of reverence and humility that animates the document. It's not a fiery broadside against the British, although obviously there's a list of uh, injustices that they have against the British Crown, but nonetheless, they emphasize the ties that they have of kinship and a feeling of a sense of that the British are remain their brethren and all the rest of it, and the forms of England that they continue to revere. But there's a great deal of emphasis on humility, what they owe to God, how they consider their role in upholding their own sacred honor as part of their task as freemen. So I think that the emphasis on the Almighty, particularly the very last lines, usually the emphasis on the Creator is highlighted in the opening lines, but I would close with, this is a short comment just on the humility and the reverence of the document, but the very last line or two, it states that they are absolved from all allegiance to the British Crown. All political connection between them and the state of Great Britain is to be totally dissolved, and they are to rise as free and independent states. And for the support of this declaration, with a firm reliance on the protection of divine providence, we mutually pledge to each other our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor. I think that the notion of sacred honor has faded certainly today, and it's worth considering what was meant by it at the time, how a person would understand the sacred honor that they owed to their countrymen and to their country, what it meant to give of yourself in a way that would be honorable. So those are some opening thoughts I have tying the Declaration to Fidelity.
Good. Thank you, Deborah. Thank you. Ben, if I can toss one back to you now. The founding fathers, the authors and signers of the Declaration of Independence, drew a distinction that we don't hear about very much anymore. But it was a very important distinction to them, and I wonder if it would behoove us to recover it. And that's the distinction between liberty and license. They thought freedom was one thing and very important, but it must not be allowed to degenerate into licentiousness, license. Have you given any thought yourself to this distinction, so important to the founders, liberty as opposed to license?
Well, I think it's one of the reasons that we did so well early on, because we took our liberties. In some cases, we went a little bit too far with the liberties in terms of trying to impose righteousness upon people, and that's obviously not the correct way to do it. But I think the feeling of the Puritans and some of the others were that men are inherently wicked, and you therefore have to impose upon them restraints, and you have to control their behavior. And it led to communities that were not particularly friendly to people who didn't agree with the philosophies that were put forth. So that's a place, I guess, where liberty and license kind of clash when you attempt to impose upon others. And we see it around the world, places that don't have our background of true liberty. The people generally are not very free. And a lot of the pilgrims who came over here, they were coming from a perspective of people ruling their lives, taking their livelihoods, basically enslaving them. And they wanted something different. And I think our founders are to be greatly admired because they studied every single governmental facility and instrument that had ever been used in civilization. And they were eclectic. They took the good stuff and they threw the bad stuff out with the hope that it would give us something that was lasting. And the fact that it has lasted for 250 years tells you there was something really magical almost about what they did. I think it was a God-inspired endeavor, and that's the reason that it's lasted so long. But you'll notice that the people who want to change it and alter it are also people who don't have a lot of great things to say about God. And when you look at Marxism and communism and socialism, they don't have a lot of good things to say about God either. Why? Because they want to be the ones who give you the way that you should live. And if you don't live that way, uh, they feel empowered and justified to remove your liberty.
Yeah. Let me note to our online participants, welcome. You're very welcome to ask questions. You can type your questions in and we will get to them later in the webinar. Erica, if I can go back to you now, following up on the points that Dr. Carson was making there. One of the things the founders seem to be concerned about was what has come to be known as civic virtue. Uh, it seemed to be their opinion that liberty without civic virtue was doomed. So you needed some virtue in the people. Now, that's got to be consistent with their view that human beings are fallen creatures. If we read Federalist number 10 in the run-up to the ratification of the Constitution, you see that Madison, the author of that paper, and of course one of the principal architects of the Constitution, is under no illusions about human nature. He sees all the bad stuff about human nature, and nevertheless, he and his co-authors, co-writers of the Federalist Papers, Hamilton and Jay, insist that while constitutional structural constraints on power are important protectors of liberty, they are secondary, auxiliary precautions, that the main protections of liberty have to be in the virtue of the people and civic virtue. Do you have some thoughts about the relationship between our understanding of liberty, our principles of American liberty, and virtue?
I had many thoughts.
Yeah.
Thank you for laying that out. I mean, I think it's really, really good to see how, um, in the lineup to the question, you note that obviously the procedures erected are really important, and that is something that they draw, from all of these texts that we've mentioned already, mixed forms of government, rule of law, et cetera, and really, the common law that undergirds all that in terms of private law in the background. Um, but that virtue was absolutely assumed. And, one of the things your dear friend and my mentor, Marian Glendon, has pointed out throughout her entire career is that the family structure that undergirded that, not only the religiosity, of course, of the people, but also the family. And I think what's so interesting is that, at some point in her career, she said, we really ought to like amend the Constitution or something to get the family in there because it was such a basic presumption of the founding generation that the family would be the place, not only, yes, local, institutions and civic institutions and intermediate institutions, churches, et cetera, would care for one another, but that the robust work of the family would be primary. I mean, and this is why when, Tocqueville comes, not too long after the founding, although several decades, and observes what's going on, especially in New England, but just sort of takes note of the way in which it wasn't as though, sometimes there's an idea put forth that, women were sort of these kind of unimportant characters in this whole operation. And now, historians have talked about this idea of Republican motherhood, which was something that you could say that Tocqueville was observing, that women had such a kind of fundamental place in being highly educated, not educated in terms of university yet, but educated, and he said like manly education and manly virtue. He even uses these kinds of words, so that they could kind of be take up, not only faith, which he thought they had more of than maybe men, but also reason, that they could reason. And they could pass these things on to, at that point, their sons, but of course, their daughters too. And so he notes that, three quarters through, the way through his whole text, he says that it is, if you look around, how can I explain the prosperity of this nation? Like, what is so different? And he says it's really these American women, their mothers, who took so seriously the importance of their roles as formers of the next generation, doing the kind of formation in the home at that point, which was it was still a very agrarian time, forming the next generation in the virtues that would be needed for self-governance. And that's not only like in taking their place as potential representatives, but it's really just the governance, self-governance needed that is, synonymous what we understand as virtue is be able to, if we don't have the kind of self-governance, then laws would have to be erected, right? I mean, this is like the Hobbesian version that the founders did not want to go down, which is that if you sort of allow, have this idea that Hobbes had that really we're all just kind of desiring, passionate human beings, and we just need law, which he understood is very much disconnected from a kind of natural law. If we just have law and a big sovereign, powerful kind of authoritarian state will be what we need to ensure that the passions are subdued. Well, the founder said, no, 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 what we need is virtue, right? And
Mhm.
Hobbes was, you could say, skeptical of the idea that we could,
Yeah, sure.
actually inculcate virtue, right? He named those virtue theorists. He named Aristotle and Cicero and Thomas Aquinas and said, that's not
Yeah.
really the way. We can't do that. Look at the wars of religion. And the founder said, no, we believe that we actually can, or at least we're going to take a shot at this idea of ordered liberty, right? This experiment in ordered liberty. And the last point I'll make is I think a really important one, because I think sometimes we can get very despondent about our time and this and that and these people and those people. But the founders knew that this was the work of every generation, that it was every generation's work to form the next generation. And this is a sadness that I have as someone who actually has many children and takes my husband and I take our work of formation of our children very, very seriously. We see it as our most important work. That kind of work of motherhood and fatherhood together, collaborating together has been seen to be as not as important work. And I think it is that work that, again, the founders took for granted as being something that could help to cultivate the virtues of self-government so that we could be a self-governing, continue to be a self-governing people. And so without that understanding, without an appreciation that we're not just consumers and producers, we don't just like have all these, I don't know, like, credentials and careers and all this stuff. We actually are made for something more, which is happiness and friendship. And to have that kind of fidelity that both, Deborah and Ben spoke about, we need to be able to become trustworthy people, right? And to do that, we need to cultivate those virtues first and foremost in our homes. And if that work isn't taken seriously as real important, like the most important work that anyone does, I think it's going to be hard to have a self-governing republic to really sustain it. And I think that's a lot of kind of what we've seen over the last couple of decades.
I certainly want to say amen to that, Erica. Certainly, we at Fidelity Month and in the Fidelity Movement understand that to have the virtue in the people that is necessary to sustain a Republican government, government by the people themselves, self-government, you can't rely on government to give people the virtue. The government doesn't know you as an individual. Government doesn't work with you as you're growing up with your particular strengths and weaknesses and sensitivities and sensibilities. If we're to have a virtuous people, and we need one for a republic to survive, we're going to have to rely on what Marianne Glendon calls those intermediate institutions, the institutions of civil society, what Edmund Burke called the little platoons, that play the primary role, not only in providing health, education, and welfare, but even beyond that in inculcating virtue, in instilling in young people as they're growing up the qualities, the habits of heart and mind that they need to lead successful lives and to be responsible citizens of a democratic republic. Government really can't do that by itself. It depends, as do all the institutions of society. They depend on having some virtue in the people, but it's up to the family. It's up to mom and dad and grandma and grandpa and auntie and uncle and pastor and teacher and rabbi and priest and coach and librarian and little league, coach and all the people who actually work with kids to instill in them the virtues that we need to make the whole system function. So these things are not disconnected; they're very tightly connected. Devor, if I can move over to you, one of the interesting things about work being done now by academics on the American founding and on the Declaration of Independence is we seem to be developing or perhaps recovering a sense of the American experiment as and in a sense, a covenant, not just a social contract, not just a deal. I'll respect your liberty if you respect my liberty. But it seems to be an example of a covenant. Of course, when we think about covenant, we get that idea from the Bible, from the Hebrew Bible, from the idea of God's entering into a covenant with his people. I'm thinking of work by Yuval Levin, The American Covenant, Eric Nelson up at Harvard, and others. Do you have some reflections you could share with us about that?
Sure. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. I think that there, since we're focusing on the Declaration, it is interesting to note that they do seem to be, it does seem to be somewhat premised on the idea that there was a covenant with England, and that covenant wasn't just a business contract. It does mention ties of kinship, a sense that there is this brotherhood between America and England. It nods to these sort of more transcendent ties that are not simply um, transactional and
Mhm.
contractual, but at the same time, it suggests that that covenant has dissolved, and it's time to not dispense with the notion that covenants are of value in general, but to emphasize that something new has emerged among the people of America, and that there's a new sort of sacred bond that must be respected among the American populace. But what's interesting is that the colonies in America, as Tikva, where I work, has emphasized over and over again through also the work of Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik, who I know is another one of your dear
My
students,
student.
Professor Ward.
Yeah, yeah.
Yes, William Bradford, the founder of the Plymouth Plantation, was a devotee of the Hebrew language. He had a small notebook in which he would write verses from the Bible, and he would practice writing them in Hebrew. And he had all these little phrases and words that he was constantly teasing out and trying to get a sense of the written word. And he compared himself in this practice to Moses looking into the land and not being able to enter it, but wanting it and loving it, and yet not being able to fully immerse himself in it. So he had this love of the Hebrew language as a sort of tie to a covenant that he somewhat wished, I suppose, that he could fully enter into. And that animating spirit, I think, was part of what formed the Plymouth Plantation, the pilgrims who were there. The sense that they were entering into a new sort of covenant as colonists. And there was something about this land that lent itself to a wholly new project. And I think that that spirit has not totally dissipated. And I think that you could even look for a picture of the sort of virtuous bonds in the Declaration itself, which doesn't mention the word virtue, but also doesn't mention the word individual or the word license. It's not sort of giving the individuals carte blanche to do whatever they want. It's nods toward a sketch of the human person that does owe something to his countrymen and to his community. So those are some opening thoughts. I don't want to speak over long. There's a wonderful wealth of thinking and writing throughout TIC ideas on this particular topic, and it's very rich.
Yeah, I'm so glad that you mentioned my beloved former student, Rabbi Meir Soloveitchik. He's, of course, done very important work on that alongside the two other people that I mentioned, Yuval Levin of the American Enterprise Institute and Eric Nelson up at Harvard. Let me raise another issue. During that very rough period we went through, not only in the academic world, but more broadly in the culture, that I call the high woke period from, I don't know, roughly maybe 2019 or so to 2024. American ideals and institutions were widely deprecated, um, uh, ridiculed, dissed on the ground that so many of the men who signed the Declaration, indeed the author itself, the principal author, as you rightly point out, Erica pointed out, that was a committee effort. Ben Franklin and others were on the committee, John Adams. Um, but including Jefferson himself were slave owners. And so people say, well, how can the document be any good? How can its principles be any good when the people behind it included slave owners? They weren't all slave owners. Adams, Hamilton, men like that hated slavery. And even people like Jefferson regarded it as a necessary evil, but as an evil, and hoped that someday it would die out. But It is true that the principle of equality, which was celebrated in the Declaration itself, all men are created equal, was dishonored. We had slavery from the start, and it lasted for more than fourscore and seven years after the founding of the Republic, and was only ended by a bloody, horrible civil war, unbelievable, unprecedented carnage. What do we make of that tragic historical fact that the very people proclaiming equality, equal dignity, basic human rights, unalienable rights, did not do away with slavery, and some of them practiced slavery? Anybody have thoughts on that?
I do.
Go ahead, Ben.
Let's say you have a society that's driving their cars in the neighborhood at 20 miles per hour, and everybody's going 20 miles per hour. That's what the speed limit is. And then subsequently, you find that 20 miles per hour is too fast and too many kids were getting hit. You really need to go 10 miles an hour. So you're going to go back and impose fines on all the people who were going 20 miles an hour. But at that time, that was the speed limit.
Yeah, yeah,
Slavery is sort of like that. Um, it was common. People did it. Their fathers did it. Their uncles did it. Their neighbors did it. And to impose a penalty on them for what we've learned may not be the right thing to do. Maybe the right thing to do is to learn from the mistakes of the past and move forward. But if you go back and you spend all your time concentrating on the fact that they were going 20 miles an hour, can you believe that? That's not going to lead to peace.
yeah, yeah. It does seem to me that if we look at our history, including slavery, beginning with slavery, we've never really had a reason to be embarrassed or ashamed of ourselves when we've lived up to the principles of the Declaration of Independence, when we have treated all men as created equal, when we have respected unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Where we have reason to be ashamed in our history, where we have reasons for regret, it's when we violated those principles. So I'm with you, Ben. It seems to me to be wrong to condemn the principles, to condemn the Declaration's constituting ideas for the wrongs of the people who drafted it in some cases. But again, I'd stress that even in the case of some of the people who owned slaves, like Jefferson himself, they knew it was wrong. They just couldn't figure out the way to get out of it. Jefferson said, it was speaking of slavery. Jefferson said, I tremble for my country when I reflect that God is just and that his justice will not sleep forever. But it was the same Jefferson who said, again, speaking of slavery, we've got a wolf by the ears. We know we can't hold him, but we dare not let go. They felt trapped, as it were.
But
Any
And I,
reflections, Erica and Devore?
but the principles,
Oh, yeah, Ben, go right ahead.
were the principles were excellent, and they got us to the right place. When you stop and think about how rapidly our country changed, I think back to when I was 6 years old and went to the Deep South with my family to visit relatives. And there were whites only and colors only signs. And they were warning me about what you could do and what you couldn't do. Now, in the same lifetime, we have Black admirals and generals and CEOs of Fortune 500 companies and heads of foundations and university presidents. We've had a Black president of the United States, all in that same lifetime.
Yeah.
And that's because of those values and those principles. There was a fidelity to them. Also, do remember that slavery was something in just about every society going
Yeah,
back.
in human history. Yeah.
Nobody's really avoided it. But we had so many people who were vehemently opposed to it that we fought a bloody civil war and lost a large portion of our population to stop it. We generally don't talk about those people on the other side. We don't talk about the people who created the Underground Railroad and how they risked everything, including their lives, in order to keep freedom for other human beings. Uh, so we should talk about that's the thing that really makes us unique. And that uniqueness comes from fidelity to those values.
Ben, your comment there reminds me of Dr. Martin Luther King when he was demanding civil rights, equal rights for Black Americans. He didn't condemn the Declaration. He didn't condemn the principles of the founding. He said, "You wrote a check, and I'm cashing the check. I'm here to demand payment on the check." It took a long time. I agree with that. It took longer than it should have taken, even after that horrible, bloody Civil War. But King didn't say, "Let's have a revolution and overthrow the country." King said, "Let's make the country make good on its promise." He treated the Declaration as a promissory note.
Right.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah, go ahead, Deborah.
I would add that there are many authoritarian countries that have fine-sounding constitutions and that betray them with regularity to the point where it is a meaningless document. But as you say, Martin Luther King saw the Declaration as a promissory note, and Jefferson felt that there was a wolf by the ears. There was a sense that the American people had to live up to the promises of that declaration and what the Constitution signified. And they constitutionally, meaning dispositionally, could not abide the continuation of this practice. So as you both said, the fact that they actually gave up so much to uphold those ideals, ultimately, I think, emphasized how important and how meaningful they were to the country as a whole. And certainly not that it was completely hypocritical and meaningless to the people who wrote them.
Yeah, amen. It was a question, as Ben pointed out, of fidelity. We began with the right principles, but we weren't faithful to them. And King demanded, others demanded that we be faithful, and that we worked our way, a lot of conflict, a lot of pain, a lot of suffering, but eventually to the point where we became more faithful to those principles. We made good on the promise, not completely, not 100%, obviously, but gosh, the tremendous progress that Ben pointed out in his own lifetime. I mean, it's extraordinary. Uh, yeah,
Can I,
go ahead,
oh,
Erica. Yeah,
sorry, can I add some more? These have been
absolutely.
beautiful, beautiful reflections. And I just want to add, I mean, I think one of the remarkable things that you've all said, but about the American founding, the principles that come out of, the Western tradition in terms of like Roman law, Judeo-Christian inheritance and Greek philosophy is this capacity for self-correction, for like contest within. And I think it's a really important lesson that we take from these remarkable people like a Martin Luther King, but also Frederick Douglass, Lucretia Mott, Sarah Grimke, who are all working within this tradition to correct the tradition, but working within it. I mean, even someone like Mercy Otis Warren, who's the figure of my initiative at Arizona State, that all of them are sort of working within the tradition to correct Mercy Otis to get the Bill of Rights, but in an understanding of virtue as necessary and religion is important. And so one of the things that I think it pushes us to ask as we think about these principles as subject to contest is and revision in terms of their content is the way in which, I mean, if you just look at the history of slavery, like why it continued was because of political compromise that we can now look back and say was a failure of conscience, to be sure, even if
Mhm.
they couldn't move away from it, but that it was that, as I think Robbie pointed out, that there's a sense of even those who thought it was wrong were stuck in, I think, an economic reliance on it in the South. And so we need to then look to ourselves instead of condemning them, like start to say to ourselves, okay, we like equality, we like liberty, we want to contest those principles. What does equality contain? What does liberty mean? Because those are principles that the human spirit kind of longs for, and it's and how is it different from, how's my view of equality and even sexual equality different from others who I debate with on either side of the aisle, right? But then we have to like look at ourselves and say, where are we myopic? Like, where are we missing? And how is our economy based upon some sort of reliance on some other injustice that really, another generation is going to condemn us for? And I just think that's where our hearts need to be in thinking about, if we can look back with such ease and say, look at these imperfect people. I mean, we are all imperfect. And, but for the grace of God go I. Like, what am I doing in my own life that is not living up to these principles? And what is our own time doing that we are not working to within this beautiful tradition that allows contest, that allows us to think through these questions? Where is that? And for me, it's very clear that a lot of our economy relies on access to abortion, very easy access to abortion, to, you know, and this is a lot of writing I've done on this, right? Is just in this sense that as the Southern economy relied on slavery, that how have we positioned the whole idea of women's equality around easy access to abortion? And so, is that something that we're being myopic about? Is that a challenge we need to take on and say, is there some sort um, of, unethical reliance that we ought to be, looking at critically ourselves now and finding another way, just like our country found another way forward for the equal dignity of Black Americans. And I think it's an important, time of like an examination of conscience for ourselves rather than criticizing the people behind, in the past. Like, let's look at ourselves and how we're imperfect, because we most certainly are.
So profound, so wise, Erica. Thank you. Thank you. I've been thinking about this just in the last couple of days. I mean, somehow so many people have gotten it into their heads that it's okay to basically exterminate handicapped people, people with Down syndrome, people who are otherwise good people. They don't lie, they don't cheat, they don't steal, but somehow they've gotten into their heads that a Down syndrome child is somehow less precious, less valuable, that we can exterminate them because they are inadequate, don't live up to our standards. I mean, gosh, we condemn people in the past for slavery, but let's look at the beam in our own eye. Let's be self-critical, look at ourselves and our shortcomings. I think it's just such a powerful point. I'm going to move on to something else here now briefly, having to do with faith and patriotism, faith and public life. The four of us are religious believers. We believe in God. And as believers, we believe that our first obligation, above all, is to God. Some people have suggested that, well, if that's true, then patriotism really can't be treated as a virtue. That patriotism sets up the state as an idol, A-I-D-O-L, an idol, and that we need a more neutral stance toward political authority, toward the government, toward the law, toward the state, lest we fall into a kind of idol worship, lest we fail to give God his due. Um, Erica, maybe I could begin with you, and then Devorah, and then Ben this time. And I'd especially like you, Erica, as a Catholic, and Devorah, you being from the Jewish community, to reflect from the perspective of your own traditions, because Catholics and Jews in the United States have, at an earlier time, and to some extent, today, even today, been accused of not having a true loyalty to the United States because your first loyalty is to your religion. I mean, gosh, Catholics couldn't even aspire to high public office in the old days because they were thought to be loyal to an authoritarian church and to a foreign prince in the person of the Pope and so forth. Devorah, even today, people accuse Jewish members of our community, Jewish fellow citizens, of having a dual loyalty to the state of Israel. Um, how do you think about the relationship of your faith and your obligation to put God first? How do you think of the relation of that to your patriotic duty as citizens of this republic. Erica, do you want to go first?
Yeah, it seems to me to be almost something I don't even understand the critique. So it's hard for me to give a full response because it seems to me that as having been a person, who grew up without faith in a very, broken home and then came to faith later, it seems to me that what my faith does, and I have a very deep devotion within, the Catholic faith, spent this morning, just thinking about and praying about what I would do right in front of the Blessed Sacrament. So it is a fully fully lived Catholic faith. And it seems to me that what I've seen in my own life and in the life of my husband, the life of my children, the life of my neighbors, as we help to establish a very vibrant classical school here in Massachusetts with waiting lists at 380 students, and I'm
Wow.
on the board. A board of another really vibrant girls Catholic school here in Massachusetts, that what I see faith does is enliven the person. I mean, one of my favorite, quotes from Saint Irenaeus is "The glory of God is man fully alive," and I think it's and the fact that my Savior Jesus Christ was fully human, was a perfect human, and that all of that through grace, through the sacraments, but also through living, trying my best to live a life of virtue, is that it does first and foremost bring me to a deeper friendship with God, and that is the kind of whole point of my life, is friendship with God, so I can be in eternal friendship with Him and eternal beatitude. But that what that does is that it also sort of allows me to be in true friendship with others, true friendship in an Aristotelian sense, in some sense, like aiming for their good as other selves, not only with my husband in a deep spousal friendship and with my children as they grow, but then in others and civic friendship, that we can then think about the good together. Like, what is it that our community needs? It needs clearly a classical school, as we saw. But then in my own work, at my own journal, which brings together more, religious women thinkers and scholars with radical feminists and other kinds of thinkers together for kind of civic friendship, even though we disagree on many things, that there are places we agree that are so fundamental to kind of pushing things forward in the way that we think that would be better for men and women as truly equal but also different. And so all of that comes together, and I mean, one of the things I love, I'll just mention Pope Leo's recent encyclical since he just came out, is the great is just echoing John Paul II, like, be not afraid. That one of the beautiful things about living as a person of faith is that we are, deeply in friendship, trying to be in friendship with the God who is ever new, who makes all things new, and that we're not just sort of, it's not just a tradition that we need to look back at, though we learn so much from the inheritance of tradition, that the Holy Spirit in my faith is alive today, and that is helping us to find solutions to problems we have today in common with others with whom we can kind of come together, but as friends. And I think, to me, it's just such a powerful way of living, where so much good can be done. And it's away from this idea of kind of despair for the future, just all the anxiety that people all across the country have. And the last thing I'll say is, I think because they root their hope in politics, right? Which is an important way that we come together for the common good, no question, at the local level, at the state level, the national level. But that really we have to have these civic friendships first and foremost if we're going to make any gains there, and that all of that comes from having friendship, I think, and carrying out the duties we owe in justice and piety to God first and foremost. So to me, it's like an enlivening principle that allows me to be the best citizen I can be, and also a good friend to my neighbors and even those with whom I disagree.
Very good. Devorah?
That was so beautiful, Erica. Thank you. It's funny. My thinking was going in a very different direction, but I was inspired by what some of Erica said. And funnily enough, I don't know if anyone of you is familiar with this, but there's a trend on Twitter called Shabbos Reads, hashtag Shabbos Reads, which is basically on Saturday night after Shabbat, the Jewish Sabbath concludes, people post about what they've read during the 25 hours where we're offline. So there's a lot of reading that tends to happen. And I actually read a good amount of the new encyclical as my Shabbos read, part of it anyway. So that was funny. But part of that, what struck me about the encyclical is related to your question, Professor George, which is the contrast between Babel, which is sort of a universalizing idea, which the notion that you're kind of um, eradicating languages, eradicating particularities, versus what the Pope noted is the particularity of Jerusalem, which has its own sort of beauty and the idea of local attachments and a shared tradition, a shared language as being something that other people can benefit from too, even those outside of the particular culture that Jerusalem signified. So that's one thing that the Hebrew Bible at least emphasizes the particular. So the notion that a belief in God somehow counters or undermines a love for one's neighbor, a love for one's community or country, I think truly is just undermined by much of the Hebrew Bible's emphasis on place and family and local loves and so forth. Um, the other side of it, based on Erica sharing her personal experiences, is that I grew up in an Orthodox Jewish community. All the people on the small street where I grew up are Orthodox Jewish. That wasn't the case when I was very young, but now it is. And I went to Orthodox Jewish schools throughout my childhood, and it was a very patriotic upbringing. We recited the Pledge of Allegiance as a school every morning. We would sing the national anthem before school productions and at school assemblies. And it really was emphasized that as Jews, it is sort of your like super obligation to be grateful for this country and to live up to its ideals and to be good citizens and contributors, because everywhere else the Jews did not have that privilege, or whatever you like to call it, that particular benefit. They were always Jews as Jews, and they were dhimmis or other sorts of lower class citizens. And in America, as we said, America does live up to its ideals, and so American Jews certainly have spiritual ties to the land of Israel. I would never suggest otherwise, and I think that there is a deep love that many Jews in general have for the holy places of Israel. But the notion that somehow would undermine fealty to American welfare and the American Jewish community, the American, the feeling that the American Jewish community has for America, I don't think that's to our intention. And I don't know how political you'd like to get, but at least in my experience, the American traditionally religious people that I know love this country deeply, have an immense sense of gratitude for it. And I've never gotten the sense that the two would be in tension with one another. So
Yes, I feel the same. I feel the same way. Ben, I don't know if you have anything to add, but please do if you do.
Well, I would just say that as our country was formed, there was not a real conflict because you could easily adhere to your religion and still be patriotic. It's really only been in recent times that it's become an issue. Sort of starting in the 60s when we said no praying in public schools, no Bibles in public school. And you have government saying, we don't want you to talk about this, automatically putting themselves in the higher position when it was perfect, reasonable harmony before. So I guess the question becomes, is that a good thing? What's so good about taking the Ten Commandments out of schools? Uh, what's wrong with thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not commit adultery, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not covet, yet you should honor your parents? What's wrong with those things? And the people who want to elevate government to a superior position never seem to have an answer for that. And I think it's a sign of the times that we're in. But I also see a religious awakening occurring, particularly among the young males. I think they're looking down the pike and they're seeing where we're going, and they're not liking it. And I think you're going to see increasing resistance.
Yeah, I take some encouragement from what I say on that front as well, Ben, but I think there's also a danger there that I'm seeing. I wonder if you're seeing this as well, especially again in young men. Um, some young men don't like what they're seeing. They don't like the fact that they've been accused of being toxic, being full of toxic masculinity and all that. And they react to it in a way that I think is counterproductive by assuming a hyper macho masculinity, looking to sexual conquests to show their masculinity. There's some chauvinism, even anti-Semitism, kind of leaking in among young, even religious young. I see it more. In fact, I see it almost not at all among women, young women, religious young women. But I'm starting to see a bit of that among young men, conservative men, religious men, and that worries me. And that's, I think, where especially adult men need to really be great role models.
Mhm.
That the faith isn't about hypermasculinity. To be a good husband and be a good father is to fulfill a vocation to serve. You serve your spouse, you serve your children. Certainly, sexual conquests are not signs of true masculine virtue. And of course, we have to stay a million miles from ethnocentrism, chauvinism, racism, anti-Semitism. We can never let that creep in under the label of religion or Christianity. Are
Well,
you seeing any of this as well, Ben?
I do see people diverging into two different pathways.
Yeah.
Uh, the ones who go down that road of sexual conquering and masculinity have not inculcated into their vocabulary or their philosophy the thing that Jesus said was so important. He said, "These two commandments I give you: love
Mm.
God with all your heart and love your neighbor as yourself." If you do that, it automatically excludes that kind of behavior.
Yeah, actually, when you think about it and it comes down to fundamentals, it's pretty basic. Because Jesus is echoing Deuteronomy with that first commandment, love God with all your heart and all your mind and all your strength. And then he adds, your neighbor as yourself, the golden rule of do unto others as you'd have them do unto you, which you find also in the Jewish faith, and you find it in many of the world's religions. Well, again, we are inviting questions from our audience. I've got a couple of questions, or a question and a comment here. Why don't I toss them into the mix? The first one says, in the part that is pertinent that I can understand, um, is there a more pressing problem than radical autonomy, where, from the president down to murderers, Americans today reject traditional institutional authority? Do we have a problem, you think, with people rejecting traditional institutional authority? And is that basically down to this deification of personal autonomy? Nobody has authority over me. I get to do whatever I want, whenever I want, however I want, with whomever I want. Anybody have a thought in response to that question? Yeah,
Yeah,
Erica.
if I could, I do think that, this mistrust of authoritative institutions is a real thing. But I actually want to just hop on I appreciate both of you speaking to Jesus and his understanding of service in the Christian life. And I would also just say that my own conversion from kind of a radical feminism came through very good men. I mean, there are good women in my life too, but my contemporaries in college and in graduate school, et cetera, just incredibly good men who reflected to me that was the possibility of good men out there. And so I want to just speak to this idea of authority, because I think that we live at this time where I think many people, and I think it kind of happens on both the left and the right, take on, I'm going to mention Thomas Hobbes again, but like a kind of a Hobbesian view of authority and,
Yeah.
and of submission, which is a very different account of authority in the Jewish and Christian tradition and in, the great classics, like, I mean, even going back to Plato and Aristotle, that authority is responsibility. You even see, and I've tracked this now, asking a classicist to see if I'm right about this, but you certainly see this in Thomas Aquinas and Augustine, and you actually also see it in Plato and Aristotle. When they're talking about the idea of just rule, they all use the word care. They use the word care because it's care for the other. And so, you even see in Plato and Aristotle this idea of a shepherd caring for his sheep. And then, of course, this comes up in Jesus's own understanding and teaching about about God the Father. And so I think to link authority back to responsibility, that those who have authority have responsibility to care for those over whom they have authority. And this is in the workplace, this is obviously our public servants, and in all different institutions where people have authority. I just think it's really important to think that unjust rule is when self-interest becomes the primary kind of way of thinking about how I'm going to act toward the other. And again, this is just in the Republic. You can go find it right there, that the idea is that a just account of authority has to do with care. And for Thomas Aquinas, that law is, an ordinance of reason for the common good by he who has authority or care of the community, which is promulgated.
Community.
And authority and care is like synonymous there. And I think it's a really important aspect to kind of help our young men, young women, whoever it is that have these flaws account of authority, that caring for the one over whom I have authority is a really important aspect, and one that has to be cultivated, because it's not easy. We tend to want to be kind of narcissistic and think about ourselves and building ourselves up, and caring for others and having the capacity to do that is something that needs work. It's the part of self-governance is then becoming a mature adult who can care for others, take responsibility for others, and that's what true authority is.
Thank you, Erica. I have a comment here rather than a question, but it's a wonderful comment from one of our participants whose name is Tim. And Tim says, as a Christian, my loyalty is to Christ first and foremost. The religious liberty defined in the First Amendment of the Constitution of the United States of America secures this freedom for all Americans. My faith in Christ empowers me to be a better citizen to this nation by imparting to me the virtues necessary for liberty and freedom to flourish. That certainly sounds right to me. Does that sound right to you? How about you,
Yeah.
Ben?
Absolutely, right on target.
Yeah, yeah, good.
If I could jump into the other question, more.
Absolutely.
Okay, so regarding the issue of radical autonomy, I think this goes back to what we were discussing previously about our duty in each generation to protect liberty. So the founding generation was protecting liberty from the British government, let's say, and later the United States protected liberty from the blight of slavery, and then we protected liberty from communism and Nazism and so forth. And now we're in the position of protecting liberty from ourselves, as Erica noted, with the problem of abortion and many other sort of radical autonomy ideas that have filtered in and have warped our conduct and our sense of what we owe one another, our sense of what we owe our country and ourselves really and our community as well. But there's a wonderful book called Habits of the Heart, which defines it's by Robert Bellow and a team of other sociologists, which attempted to distill different American understandings of the individual, because basically Americans love the notion of the individual, and we're very attached to that, and it's bound up with our idea of what liberty is. But there is a sort of Protestant tradition, and this goes with the other comment regarding responsibility to God as being first and foremost. The Protestant tradition emphasizes the individual's responsibilities. So it's the Norman Rockwell person standing up in a town hall meeting and making his voice known. It's the person who steps up and takes real responsibility and feels an obligation to vote or feels an obligation to run for local office. This is a person who is a leader in their local church. It's the notion of the individual as a leader, as a person who has unchosen obligations that they must live up to.
Mm.
And many of those obligations are chosen, which is kind of part of the liberty element of it. But nonetheless, it's on you to build your country and your home and your community. Then there's the notion of the individual as merely a sort of outlet for some kind of tyrannical self-expression. That if you're not expressing yourself, you're betraying yourself in some way. So I think that is somewhat of a product of therapy culture, and I think it's exacerbated by certain technologies like our AI companions who talk to us all the time if we so choose to talk to them. I have friends who do this, and it kind of frightens me. But
Yeah.
it's this notion that you're constantly searching yourself, you're constantly reflecting yourself back to yourself. It's a sort of self-flattery that does not lead to, I think, human flourishing and human fulfillment in the highest sense, because you're not looking outwards. So I think that there is an American tradition of individualism that leads the person out the door towards their neighbors, because they're the only ones who can do that particular role for others. those are some quick thoughts.
That's very wise to word, it seems to me. And you mentioned the great late, very great, I think he was Berkeley sociologist Robert Bella and his magnificent book Habits of the Heart. I think it was Bella, tell me if I'm wrong about this, who introduced the phrase expressive individualism to try to
Yes,
capture
yes,
the
yes. I was
ideology
reaching
of
for that phrase.
autonomy.
That's right.
Yeah, expressive individualism. And let me call attention to a wonderful book that develops that notion by Carl Trueman, who's a contemporary scholar, I believe, at Grove City College. He spent a year with us here at the Madison program at Princeton as a visiting scholar. But his work, which easily people can access online, takes that notion of expressive individualism from Bella and then tries to rigorously map how it works in the ideology that so many Americans, really across an ideological spectrum, have adopted. Well,
I,
we have pretty much exhausted our time. I want to thank everyone for joining us. I especially want to thank our wonderful panelists, Dr. Carson, Erica Bakayaki, and Devorah Goldman. And before we close up shop, I want to call in Christopher Parr of the Witherspoon Institute, who works with me on Fidelity Month and the Fidelity Movement, to take us to the Fidelity Month website at fidelitymonth.com. And there, as Christopher will explain, you can find ways that you can help to spread the message and get involved in a Fidelity Month. But Christopher, let me let you take it from there.
Thank you, Professor George. Thank you so much, panelists and friends who listened and asked some great questions today. As Professor George has said, the best place you can go to find information about Fidelity Month and what we're doing this June and every June is our website, and that's fidelitymonth.com, Fidelity Month all together. And you can see all of this information here. I'll just highlight a few things from the website about our programs and resources, things you can do during the month of June. The most important thing you can do is know that we're a grassroots movement. We're not an organization with a budget or staff, but we do have a logo, an icon. I'll show it here. You may have seen it other places, which is the gold myrtle wreath, a traditional symbol of fidelity back to the classical period on a blue background. We have merchandise with the Fidelity Month logo, all sold at cost, not making any profit on that, like t-shirts, yard signs, stickers, just like that, that we'd encourage you to display all throughout June. You can also display it on social media. Many of us use it as a temporary profile pic or cover photo for our social
And
media.
that's free, right, Christopher? That's free of charge. You can just download the logo, use it on your social media accounts. It doesn't cost anything.
Absolutely. For the merchandise, you just have to pay the cost of producing it, but especially for all of our digital resources, bulletin inserts, just like this one, or newsletter inserts, flyers, even some student resources for teachers, all of that's free on the website. We are on all of the different social media accounts, so Facebook, X, Instagram, YouTube. We'd encourage you to follow us there and share our resources. That helps get the word out a lot. Some other things you can do. You can write a letter to the editor of your local paper. You can encourage your elected officials or your company to officially recognize June as Fidelity Month. We're so thankful that a couple of governors have done that for the first time this year. A couple of state legislatures have done that for the first time ever. So we're very thankful for that. Uh, Also, if you're a member of a religious congregation or a member of the clergy, we'd encourage you to use the Fidelity Month prayer on our website. Maybe feature it in one of your worship services. Put it in the bulletin or a newsletter. You could even, like some clergy have done, preach sermons or homilies about Fidelity Month during June. I'll highlight for you one of the best days to do that is June 24th. That's our annual day of prayer and fasting for Fidelity Month. But you can do any of those things all month long. You can also host a speaker either at your congregation or your community to talk about the importance of any of these values we've talked about: fidelity to God, to our spouses and families, and then to our country and communities. Let me just share two additional programs. I was asked in the Q&A privately what events we're doing This is our first event for Fidelity Month, but our second event is actually going to be in person. I know some of you are in Washington, D.C., in the D.C. area. Many of you are not, but some of you are. And if you are, you should join us on June 17th at the offices of the Advancing American Freedom Foundation. They're in the Federal Triangle area in D.C. Professor George will be there. AAF's president, Tim Chapman, will be there, and they're going to talk about a similar theme like we've talked about today, but expanding on it a little bit for our contemporary moment. It's called What Holds Us Together, Fidelity at the 250th. Doors open at 9:30 a.m. for that, or excuse me, 9 a.m. Event starts at 9:30, and we'll have some pastries and coffee for you to enjoy breakfast there. And then finally, I just want to highlight one thing. I'm sure many of you don't live in Washington, D.C., but I'm sure all of you know 11th or 12th graders from high school. So if you fall into that category, which probably includes pretty much every one of us, you should encourage them to participate in our essay contest this summer, help prompting them to reflect on these themes of fidelity at the 250th. We're giving away some sizable prizes for that, more than most essay contests, so maybe that's some motivation. And then also the first place essay will be published in Public Discourse. That's the online journal of the Witherspoon Institute. So those are many wonderful things that all of you can do. We encourage you to join us in the Fidelity movement this Fidelity Month through those things.
Thank you, Christopher. And I do want to say a special word of thanks to Governor Cox in Utah and Governor Sanders in Arkansas for proclaiming June in those states to be a Fidelity Month. I'm also grateful. We just learned that the Michigan House of Representatives has officially recognized for the state of Michigan Fidelity Month. So the message is spreading, and I'm grateful to everyone who helps spread it, especially Ben Carson, Erica Bakioki, and Devorah Goldman for their wonderful contributions today. Thank you, and I hope to see you at the next Fidelity Month event.
Thank you so much.